So this last part of the lecture, part 3, this is it. I want to talk about one final and important thing, your last tool of the toolbox, and that is the idea of history versus heritage. History and heritage might seem the same thing, it might seem interchangeable, but in fact are very different. History, where do we understand history and where do we understand heritage? What's the foundation of each? Well, history is founded in the idea of facts, the idea of sources. You know, as I'm writing my PhD, I can write a narrative. I could write a story of what I'm writing about, but it would be completely wrong if I don't back up every statement with sources, with the facts. That is dictating the story. That is the idea of history. Now, of course, other things come into play. We saw the problem of single narratives. We've seen the problem that, or just the reality that different worldviews creates a very different story. And we must keep that into account. How we look at sources is subjective. What sources we use is subjective. But at the end of the day, we're trying to make the most accurate story, the truth, right, of what the event is by facing it and solidifying that story in facts. Now, on the flip side of that, heritage is different. Heritage is connected to identity. So what do I mean by that? It is not so much the truth of the matter as it is what is perceived as true. A really good friend of mine who's a fantastic historian told a story once that he's an African historian. He told a story of how he was doing this research in Africa, in Ghana, and he was at this archive and he was reading this stuff and he was writing a story about this area. And he was outside during this quick lunch break outside the archives, and he was processing the stuff he was reading, and a janitor was there. And the janitor, asked him what he was researching, and he said, I'm looking at this part of history in this area, and the people there and what it means to them. And the janitor's like, oh, I'm from this area. I know that story very well. And he proceeds to tell my friend that this is this true story. This is the history. Now, my buddy was in the archives. He was reading the documents. He was reading everything about it. And he knew what this guy was saying was completely false. There was nothing in the archives to justify this story. But he believed it was true. He believed it was right. And it was such a deep, important part of the story that everybody knew about it. Everybody felt it was part of their own identity. And for him, that was the most important thing. My friend had a dilemma. Does he tell this guy the true story based on what he had in the archives, and tell him, no, what you're telling me is completely wrong? I can show you where it's wrong. Does that matter? Because this guy's identity was tied into this story. And so that is the heritage. I want you to think of an event, something like that, or a story of your life, or something you've been told, maybe in a family story. And, it might not be true, but that doesn't matter as much as what that means and it symbolizes for your own identity. Now, that is a thing that deals with history all the time. We talk about stereotypes in history. We talk about, in my world history class, I talk about the stereotype of a caveman and to break down that into what the life really was like. But, throughout history and even today, we have symbols and we have things that on one side of it has a historical story, right? One narrative. And on the other side of it has a heritage story. And that's something completely different. And oftentimes that is stronger because it's tied to personal identity. And to say that it is false is a personal attack on that identity. You get what I'm saying? It doesn't matter if you could prove it wrong. It doesn't matter if there's sources there as much as it is tied to identity. That is a struggle of historians. That is the historical dilemma. Now, one of these major things tied to the Civil War and a memory of it, lasting legacy, is the Confederate flag. And especially in Northern California, you see a lot of Confederate flags. It's a symbol, right? It's a symbol of a lot of different things. Some people see it as a symbol of rebellion. Some people see it as a symbol of Southern rights. Some people see it as, as oppression, as a symbol of of a slave system, of, as a threat. Some people see it as, there's a lot of different interpretations for what the Confederate flag represents. That is the heritage of it, because that flag is tied to an identity, whether it's a threat to your identity or it's supporting your identity. Are you picking what I'm throwing out? So that is an important thing of what the lasting legacy is. Now, I can go through the whole history of the Civil War, the development of that flag, when it came into flag. That is the battle. A lot of times it's the battle flag. It's not even the actual Confederate flag. There's lots of flags in the Confederates, but that particular one has this particular meaning during the war, and that meaning during the Civil War is a lot different than the meaning that you see on the back of a pickup truck, on a mug, on a shirt, on a in a whatever. And that's an important thing to understand. And that is the heritage and history dilemma. Now, I want you in your own mind, I'm not going to, I want us to maybe talk about this as one of our last discussion pieces, is, is there another example that you have of whether it's an item or an idea or a value or a thought that's not so much tied into history, but it's tied more into the realm of heritage? Right? It's tied to the identity. Can you think of something like that? Can you think of an identity, an idea that's really tied to the idea of heritage more so than the history? And that's what I want us to end with, because I think that's an important thing for everyday life to understand. As a historian, I have to deal with that all the time, and I think it's a beautiful thing. I think identities are so powerful and wonderful, and the diversity of identities makes history alive and fun. It makes people diverse, and it makes the stories interesting. So, I'm not trying to say, and I want to have a caveat, I'm not trying to say the Confederate flag is one side or the other. That is for you to decide. In fact, the very foundation of my own history journey was Civil War reenacting. That's another heritage thing, right? So half the time people have an idea of this reenacting thing, of reenacting the Civil War. And you see those. If you're in Northern California, they have those in Anderson. And it's a fantastic thing. And it's a great place to dive into and understand history. But is that real history? That is up for debate. And you have to understand this coin of history and heritage, and to decipher which narrative you want to believe, what narrative you want to sort of understand and to create. And that helps make the story even bigger. The very last example, I'm a medievalist. I study medieval history here in the UK, in England, and my PhD is in medieval writing culture. And medievalism is another one of these, and what we call medievalism. Oftentimes when I study history, I get this at least once or twice a year, is I get someone ask me, is Game of Thrones a true story? Now, what's wrong with that statement? Well, A, George R.R. Martin wrote the whole thing. So obviously, and it's a novel, it's not a historical document. And there's dragons in it. Although there's lots of depictions of dragons in the Middle Ages, there's no concrete proof that there were dragons, is the way we know them. So that is that. But people have an idea, and they have such a strong belief of what the Middle Ages is, and supported by stories like Game of Thrones or other big epic movies. King Arthur is a great one. And it doesn't matter what parts of it don't seem true, what parts of it aren't true. There's a personal conviction and idea of what it is, and that is what they go with. And that is the heritage of it rather than the history. So what is your heritage and history battle and dilemma? Do you have one? I want you to think about that, because that is going to be a question on our last discussion. And thinking about in U.S. history terms, what is the difference and what is the importance and impact of history and heritage, and how do we deal with that as historians? I really want to know your thoughts, because this is a dilemma, and there's all different sides and views. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just interesting to see your thoughts, and that is an important tool to add to your historical toolbox as we end our class. Thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed this class, and this is our very last lecture, and we went through very briefly the Civil War, but we go through the Emancipation Proclamation, how the whole war was to either bring the Union to part or to separate and to create a very strong line of values of a slave system in the South, And that fell apart even after the war, where lines did not bring the country together. It actually separated it further apart in many ways, and creating a unified identity of the South that was in humiliation of the war. And that's going to take generations to fix. And that's going to be the foundation. If you start the second history class, that's where you're going to start that story. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a fantastic finish to the class, and good luck with all your finals.